today I want to share my story. So I was, my parents were missionaries in Venezuela, and this was before Venezuela got crazy. So it's years and years and years ago. And it was in the mid 80s to late 80s. So that tells me a little bit. And I was about 16 years old, 15, 16. It was during the summertime. And we were working in a group that my father had created called Jonas Ven, which is a group of young people from college and young people that he had met over time that he would bring over. And they would come over and they would share the word of God, and we would do a lot of BBS and work with children and families, and we do evangelical services and everything. So I was, during those times, this was, we had done many of that. I had been working with kids. My parents had put me to work with children since I was 12. And God called me into ministry during that time. And he placed it in my heart to minister to what you would call the French chise, I think it's called. And they were, it was a very vision, it was a vision calling, but it was a vision, and it was right out in the daytime, out with the blue, and it was like God was standing next to me, and he was so trying to tell me, yes, Rocky, this is what I need you to do. But God just said to me, Rocky, I'm what you're doing now, this is what I want you to do, like, forever. And they need to see. I need you to show them the word of God. I need you to love them. And it was and it's, I can give you a little bit more details and get emotional, but I'm trying not to get emotional, so I'm trying to avoid certain things. When God called me to ministry, I wasn't sure. I mean, I was, oh my goodness, I was 100% sure it was God, for sure. But just like everybody, when you are called into anything or God places something in your heart, you always want to be certain. That night, that afternoon, I actually do not remember, but that same day, I decided to read, going to the Bible and to Scripture, and God pointed me out Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah is it's one of my favorite prophets. And I'm going to read to you the chapter that the verses 4-9. And I have them posted right there on Facebook. But it says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Ah, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am only a child. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am only a child. You must go. Go to everyone I send you, and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand, touched my mouth, and said to me, now I have put my words in your mouth. And I want to tell you that regarding those, regarding this Bible verse, God, I just felt that God was speaking to me. At this time, I'm a teenager. I did not consider or even look at the verse and say, oh my goodness, that's, didn't overlook it because, oh, that's just Jeremiah. He's a guy. Of course, God called him. No, none of that came into my mind. what came into my mind were those words directed at me. What came into my mind, this was my discussion, this is my talk with God. I'm a teenager. I am a girl that struggles. And a lot of people were telling me that I had issues. I'm talkative. I'm always outgoing. I'm very stubborn, impatient, blah, blah, blah. And they would always, and those, you retain a lot of those comments that are made at you, especially by your family members or friends, and those are the things that you think about first. Um, so so when I hear these words from God, and God reminded me, who cares about what other people are saying? I knew you. I made you. I created you. I created you with your abilities. I created you with a knowledge. I created you with beauty. I created you with everything that you have. Everything that people are talking about, don't worry about them. Just focus on this, that I created you, and I'm going to use you, and I'm going to put my words in your mouth, and you're going to speak for me. And when I felt that call, and when I heard that, when I saw that, and when I read it in Jeremiah, I went to my dad that night, and I said to him, Daddy, and I told him the whole entire thing. I told him how I was called, what happened to me, what was I doing, and and he just, and my dad is like, he gives me a hug and he smiles and he goes, congratulations. I'm like, felicitaciones. I'm thinking in my head, what? It's not like I won a prize or anything. And he goes, and he's like, but he was congratulating me because not because I'm not exactly sure what he was congratulating. I think it was just congratulating with the fact that I was listening to God. And I think that's what it was, because the next words he goes is that, don't forget, be obedient to God. He told me, he said, do you know what he called you to do? And I go, no, I'm not sure. And then I explained to him, what I'm thinking. But he said, just be obedient. So my dad goes and tells my mom, and the next day my mom calls me over, and we're eating breakfast, and we're getting ready to go and do a puppet show and do the children's program before the evangelistic service. And my mother tells me, your dad told me that you've been called. And then she comes and tells me her calling and her story. And mind you, I had not heard this before. And she's telling me how she was called to be a missionary back in the in the 60s, and how this and that. But she was told that she could never be a missionary or do ministry because she was a woman and she was Latina. Now, my parents being Puerto Ricans, and at that time when she was called, it was a mission field. And then she did tell me, however, that those that said that to her, and I'm not gonna share too much of that because I don't want that to be involved. But she said they did eventually apologize years later because they realized they were wrong. But when my mother told me this, she tells me this thing, and she said to me, I was discouraged, and I walked away from it. And then when I met your father, and when we got into ministry, and then then the things have happened, and I see that God has called me too, and here I am, a missionary. And she said, but I want you not to be discouraged. I want you to be obedient. So that's the one thing that she told me. She said, just be obedient. And I realized that that my dad and my mom, whether they raised me and they trained me to work with children and teens and everything that they did, they kind of like they taught me everything they did. And I used all the skills I used all my skills and all the gifts that God has given me for the things that they trained me and all the things that have been growing throughout the years. But I want you to know that at this time, I had only seen one woman, a pastor, before me. There was one woman before that, that I knew, that I had met. By this time, I had met several women in leadership. My mother was already starting a church. So I knew it was possible. I didn't think it was not possible. But the first time that I knew it was possible was when I was 12 years old. And Daddy got asked to preach a holiness evangelism, a revival, in La Mesa, Texas. And I really do need to go stop by and visit that church. But when we were there, we traveled all night. It was a long drive. We got to the church and it was late at night, and we got there for dinner, and my dad knocks on the door, and a lady opens the door, and she introduces herself, and Daddy introduces us, and Daddy says to us, "This is Pastor so and so," and I cannot remember her name. And I remember that my eyes got really big, and I'm thinking in my head, but she's a girl. How could she be a pastor? And I remember she left to do something, or I don't remember exactly, but I remember turning to my dad and saying, "Daddy, how could she be a pastor? She's a girl." And then he said, anybody got calls can be a pastor. She said, "God calls women too." And I remember that. And then I remember him telling me how she felt the call that beforehand, but she's married to a Hispanic man, and they co-pastored together, but then he passed away, so she continued being the pastor of the church. So she was a widow, and she was a grandmother at the time. So her children were all grown and everything. So it was really exciting. So at this moment, here I was, about 12 years old, meeting the first woman pastor in my life, in La Mesa, Texas. An Anglo lady married to a Hispanic man that spoke fluently Spanish. It was an amazing thing. So when God called me, I knew it was already possible. I didn't think of my gender being an issue. I did not think of my gender being an issue. What I thought was going to be an issue was my personality, my lisp, because I have a strong lisp, and I was always worried about that. And then I would go back to Jeremiah, and then I was reminded of Moses, and I was then all these people came into my head, all these people with shortcomings, and Peter's stubbornness, and oh my goodness. And I realized that as I got into college, and I just say, "God, you know what? I do not know where you're going to lead me. I'm just going to let you open the doors for me wherever they may open, and I'm just going to walk right through. But there might be those days you're going to have to push me through." And he did. He got me into college. He pushed me through that. I had wonderful professors. I met amazing people that were encouragers. The porters were wonderful. They encouraged me all the time. My dad and mom would always say, especially my mom would say, "Since you've been called to be a pastor, let's come and do this with me. Do the BBS thing for me, or teach she would put me to do things as a teenager in the mission field. she was like, she was training me. And my dad would do the same thing. He goes, since you've been called to the ministry, let's train you. Let's put you here. I want you to try doing this. Or I want you to do this. And I didn't see it as my parents, just taking advantage of me at all. I never saw it that way. I saw it as them recognizing me for my calling and wanting to encourage me and train me. And I love that. I love being out there and trying new things and teach young people how to work with kids. And it was an amazing thing. I felt that's what I wanted to do, and every time I did it, it was like my heart would pound even harder and would kind of like get bigger, and I would see God at work in every single aspect. And so I think that through life, you see the need, you see the God working in your life, and you see God using you, and God teaching you as you go. And you never realize why things happen. Because later on, I really did feel by the age of by the time I got to college, I felt that I wanted to be a missionary. I went into college doing ministry and psychology. I wound up dropping psychology because as a minor, because I fell in love with social ministries and missions, and I just felt like blooming, to it just everything that I read and I absorbed, it just felt the right thing, and I felt this is where God called me to be. And unfortunately, people in my life I did encounter people in my life that were not my parents and were not my professors, but people in my life that tried to discourage me or trying to tell me that I was in ministry so that I can make way for my spouse. And of course, at the time, I didn't know who I was going to marry. I truly, truly believe. I believe that when I'm called to ministry, I truly, truly believed, and I still believe, that God calls the individual. And in college during those days, there were a lot of girls in ministry, but they were not there because they were called individually, but because they felt they can, if I marry a pastor, my life would be a lot. I would love to marry a pastor, and they would romanticize that. And I would get very upset. I would say, no, if you're here to be a religion major, then you better be called, and you better be sure that you're called. But you know what? I'll say that to the guys too. And I did. I would tell that to the guys. I said, you need to make sure that you're called, because and maybe it's because I'm a missionary's kid and a pastor's kid, and I've seen a lot of things happen, and I knew it wasn't that hard. And I knew it was going to be hard. And I knew that you had to be called. Because if you were not called into ministry, then you were not being obedient to God. And the one thing that my parents really focused on was that I needed to be obedient. And I realized that the calling into ministry is a calling to obedience. And it's a calling to obedience in everything that you do. And it's hard because it's still your life, your lifestyle, it's what you do, what you say, your relationship, your behavior. And there were times that I was not obedient. But I learned that I had to be. And one thing that I had responses, there were times that I was told that at the beginning that you know, when I was supposed to do my internship, my pastor did refuse it. He refused that. He said that was not for me. You know, I was the wrong person. Um, I was a missionary's kid. I was a girl, this and that, and that wasn't, you know, that he couldn't put me as in my internship. I couldn't do that my internship there, and because I was a girl, and that was the first time I ever encountered that. Um, this whole entire time I never had. So here's this one guy, this one man, whose daughter is engaged to a guy who's gonna be a youth pastor, and he didn't want me to be a pastor, and I didn't understand that, and you know, he's new, he's come from Mexico, um, so I was upset. I was very, very upset, and I remember telling him. I remember telling him, this is what God called me to do. Why are you saying that? Why are you saying that? I know this is what God called me to do. Maybe you need to go back and ask God, because, you know, I can talk to God and see if, hey, have you changed your mind? Am I wrong? But that's, you know, I remember being upset at him and telling him, I understand what you're saying, but that's not what God is telling me. And how do you know that God hasn't called me? I can only be obedient to him. And I remember walking away very disturbed by it. And I remember I talked to Dr. Hahn about it, and I was very upset and I was crying because I couldn't get my internship, and all the other guys already had their internship going, and here I was struggling, not getting an internship, and I didn't know what to do, and I was devastated, you know, because my pastor did not want me to intern with him, and he didn't even. I mean, he went to the extremity of not letting me preach when pastoral group, it was my turn to preach, and he would not let it happen. It was horrible, and I remember going to Dr. Hahn, and Dr. Hahn said, "Okay, I'm gonna give him a call. Don't worry, Rocky. We're gonna get you somewhere. Let me talk to him. Let me get you somewhere." And then and he did. And he called me the next day. And oh my goodness, Dr. Hahn, I've never seen Dr. Hahn upset. But that day he was upset. He's like, Rocky, you're right. He is sexist. He does not want a female pastor at all. I try to talk to him. I try to make sense to him. I told him, you know, that we have to encourage who God calls. And, you know, and he went on and he told me, and he said, but it's not going to work out. So let's just find I don't even want you going there anymore. Let's find somewhere else where you can be authentically challenged and encouraged, and somebody can mentor you, because he is not the man for you. He is not going to be the leader for you. I want you to find the right leader. So you know, my dad's best friend was the Spanish pastor. So he goes, just go to him. You know him, and you say you grew up with him. And I said to him, I know, but I wanted to really intern in the Anglo church so I can learn the culture. I mean, I'm a cross-cultural person. I mean, multicultural. This would have been and actually it would have been phenomenal, because then I would have learned the culture, because I realized I was having a hard time with the Anglo culture, and I thought this was a great opportunity for me to learn the culture, to be integrated in an Anglo church. So I was really saddened by that, because I was hoping that would give me an in, and I would learn two things. I would learn ministry, but I would learn it in the Anglo church, and I would learn the culture as well. So I thought that was one of the main reason. But I wound up being and doing into my internship in ministry in the Hispanic church, which is where I feel comfortable at anyway. But I but my, but the one thing I've learned through all that was that I stuck to my obedience. And Dr. Hahn told me about my obedience. And Hahn and Thatcher and Bratcher, all of my professors, Scobus, and they were wonderful. Dr. Harmon was there too. I had all of these amazing professors that encouraged me through it. So I think that was the first encounter that was very negative towards my ministry calling. And I've had several other people commenting, I had some students and everything. And I would tell them very simple. I would just say, if you don't agree with that, then that's between you and God. But I know what God called me to do, and I need to be obedient to my calling. I need to be obedient to God. If you disagree, then maybe you need to talk to God and ask him what you think, because I know what God wants me to do. And then over the years, I've also encountered other people telling me, or other leaders in the church telling me that I need to make way for my husband, that I need to step away and encourage him, and I would, and not to get in his way, that I just need to step back and let him, and I would, and these were leaders, very, very high up, and I remember telling them, I have not in any way, shape, or form have impeded my husband from doing his calling. And this is before my ordination, by the way. This is when my husband was working on his ordination, and I was just starting, I was finishing. We were doing our cosposal certificate at NTS, and we were NTS. And this is what we're in NTS. Well, we were in NTS. I encountered that. So I remember telling them, Todd does what his calling is, and I do what my calling is. I said, I'm doing what God asked me to do, and I encourage him to do the same. Because the calling is an individual calling, and I encourage my husband to be called to do what he asked him to do, and he encourages me to do what God asked me to do. And they would sometimes say, does he know you've been called? And I go, yeah. He's known it since we met each other. In fact, that's the first thing that put us together, or that brought us together, was the fact that we can talk about theology and biblical studies, and we can discuss, spirituality in a very depth sense. And I loved it, because I was a college student, and I loved sitting down with the other guys. We would discuss things, and I loved talking to other pastors. I got to be careful with my hand, because I'm hurting it by moving it too much. And sorry, operation still. I'm still not completely well, which is the reason why I'm at home. But anyway, so yeah, so I do know this, and the thing is that our calling has to be, we have to stick with our calling. We have to be obedient to our calling, and that's one thing that I told them in my response to them was always that I have a calling and my husband has a calling, and we're both trying to be obedient to our calling. And they would say, well, what if God calls you one way and calls Todd the other way? And I'm thinking to myself, why would God do that? Why would God call us in two different directions? It doesn't make sense. He called us individually to work together. And I truly believe that God calls you individually, and you will eventually find the other person that is going to work alongside you, and you're going to be working together as one. I know that my passion, and I think that that's the thing my professors would always say. They would always tell me, Rocky, you're so passionate. And it turns out that could be part of my ADD, which I didn't realize at that. So here I am, um, struggling to be getting through the process of being ordained, and it was really hard because the first church we went to was, and I've never had cultural shock until I went to a church that was all white in the middle of nowhere, and I had cultural shock for my very first time, and that could have, and it was in my process of ordination, um, and which is the reason why I wanted to do my internship in the Anglo Church in the first place. But I graduated from college and everything, and eventually in 1995 I was ordained. So I went through all that, and I was ordained, and I remember Dr. Johnson before the ordination, and he says, "I'm going to tell you now because I don't want to say it out there, because I don't want you crying out there on me." He goes, "But you might cry anyway." He said, and Dr. Johnson knew my mother, and he said, "Your mother will be so proud of you, Rocky." And Dr. Johnson, I known him when I was since we were in the mission field, so it was an amazing thing when I was ordained. But he encouraged me again, and he reminded me to say, "Just be obedient. He said, you have opened my eyes to something." And I remember that when I was ordained, Todd said to me, "Well, Rocky, you've made it." I said, "Aren't you excited? You made it. You finally made it. You're done." And I said to him, "What do you mean I'm done?" I said to him, "This is just the beginning, Todd. Do you realize the responsibility and the burden that now I have to carry? And now everything is going to be harder. And now this is like the beginning of the craziest and the most wildest and the most difficult time in my life." I said to him, being ordained, it's not like I just made it, Todd. I said, I'm starting new, but I'm scared. And I'm scared to death. And I'm talking as we're walking from our ordination to the eating area, and the lady behind me, there was another lady being ordained, but she was being ordained as not an elder, but a deacon. And I remember that out of the corner of my eye, I hear her smile and nod her head, and so here I was with my toddler. Little Celeste was only 18 months at the time. Very young pastor. Todd was ordained the year before. Then me. We were now co-pastors. Now we're co-ordained elders. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? And I think that's what I said that to him. "I don't know, Todd, but I've gotten myself into something. I don't know what I'm going to do." And then he hugs me and he goes, "Well, I'm proud of you, and I will be by your side." So I go back to the obedience, because the call is about obedience. The call is about obedience no matter where or when. I mean, years have gone by. Things haven't gotten any easier. Things have been hard. It's been hard because God called this Puerto Rican girl with ADD. Do you understand what a Puerto Rican person with ADD is? It's like somebody on sugar and then some. Is we were extremely emotional people. I am very emotional person. I am very passionate, which is the reason why I'm very passionate, because I'm a very emotional person. But I've had, I was, I'm very stubborn and I'm very outgoing and I do talk a lot, especially when I'm nervous. I think things out loud. I have to process things out loud. So things are very difficult for me already. And relationships is extremely important to me. So if something doesn't go right, I just break apart. So I've had to overcome so many obstacles in my lifetime just because I've decided to obey God. And so imagine that. Imagine what happened. So I figured, if Jeremiah, when you read the book of Jeremiah, you see all the obstacles that he has to go through, even as a young man being called by God. And then I realized, if he can do it, I can do it. And again, I'm not thinking about gender. I'm just thinking about a person, an individual. If this individual can do it, I can do it. If Moses could do it, yeah, sure, he messed up a bunch of times, but God used him anyway. And look at Peter. Peter didn't know when to stop talking. That sounds just like me. And God used him. So I realized that being called into ministry, it's a burden, first of all. It's a great responsibility. We have a great responsibility. But I have to swallow a lot. I have to learn to be patient with people. Okay? I have to be patient with myself. I have to be patient with my family. I've learned to swallow my pride a lot. There are times that I had to not respond. And that's for a talkative person that wants to respond very opinionatively. That's really hard to do. But I learned I've learned over the years, and my ADD and I realized that because of my ADD, I've had more difficulties. But I'm sticking to one thing. I'm sticking to being obedient. And then I realized that being called to obedient is not just about being called to ministry. It's about, am I obedient to God in what I do, in what I say, in my relationships, in how I respond to people? Am I being kind? I think if it wasn't because our church preaches holiness, it would be, if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't because I believe in holiness, and if it wasn't because God has sanctified me and continues to mold me and create me and transform me and change me in an amazing way, if it wasn't for that, I would have given up long time ago. And there's been times in my life that I have dealt with depression in a horrible way, and there was, and you know what? It wasn't men. It was women, because women, man, there are sometimes men, they want to discourage you because it hurts their gender, whatever. I don't know, their own thing. I don't know, I'm not a man. I don't know. I kind of asked Todd about that, and Todd says, I really don't understand. I think they're just, maybe they're not confident enough. It's what Todd told me. And I remember teasing back, and I said, well, if men would do their job, God wouldn't have to call women. I remember him telling him that years ago, and he laughed, and he goes, maybe you're right. But women get jealous. And women get so jealous that they, oh my goodness, they can destroy a woman in ministry faster than a man. You know why? Because we women need another another woman. We need women to encourage us and support us and lift us up. But if women don't do that, and all they do is get jealous of you, and they just want to push you back because you're younger, and yet you share the word of God, and it touches their heart, and they feel guilty, all of a sudden you're the bad person. So yes, women can be worse in our calling than men can, because they know how to put us down. And so my depression, at one point that I literally wanted to die, was because of a woman and the message she created in the church. And she got me kicked out pretty much, almost. But if it wasn't for a man, Jerry Porter, who encouraged me to continue on regardless, even when I was willing to give up my ordination at the time, because I figured she must be right. Maybe I am crazy, you know. And if it were for a man like him, I would have given up years and years and years ago. But again, Jerry would remind me of the same thing that my parents would start from the beginning. You need to be obedient to God. Be obedient to God. So please be obedient to God. Don't listen to the negatives. Don't let people push you down, because it will happen. And it doesn't happen to women only, it happens to men as well. We're just more emotional about it, I guess. But God calls. God calls anybody he wants to call. Whether you're young or old, man or woman, you know, what culture you are, does not matter. In Venezuela, he called a 17-year-old boy. Now I say boy because he wasn't 18 yet. And a 55-year-old man, or in his 50s. And that year we ordained the youngest and the oldest. So yes, God calls. And we cannot question who God calls. Our job, and this is for man or anybody else, our job in ministry is to lift up, encourage, train, mentor, share, respect other ordained and people. It is our job. The older you are, the more longer in ministry that you are, the more you have to encourage and raise up and train and uplift the younger ones, you know. And it's kind of hard because the younger ones are in this culture are becoming a little bit more, well, I'm used to that they respect the older ones, but in this culture I don't think they do. They just want to point all the bad things that you're doing, and I'm new, I'm wise, I'm young, you know, I know more. But that's not true. They don't. Because you know how I know this? Because we did the same thing. I remember I was that young person that used to think those things. And I've learned to swallow my pride, to be patient, to love regardless, to listen, to mentor, to forgive on a constant basis. Constantly forgiving those that hinder you, those that hurt you, those that want to manipulate you, those that want to bring you down, those that pull the rug from underneath you, those that stab you in your back, those that call you names, those that want to destroy, that you feel want to destroy your life. You have to be forgiving. You have to be graceful. So if you're called into ministry, it is not going to be an easy life. It's not going to be, it is not going to be beautiful with butterflies and this beautiful castle. It isn't. It's going to be a living like a martyr. It's going to be burdensome. You have a lot of responsibilities. It's going to be hard. You're going to be devastated at times. You're going to be hurt at times. You're going to get stabbed. You're going to have your rug pulled from underneath you. You're going to go through a lot. But I'm telling you, be obedient to your calling. Stick with it. Because no matter what, God is on your side, and there is nothing more powerful than God being on your side. So remember that you're called to be obedient. That's all you need to do. And I hope I've encouraged you and inspired you. But I am going to pray for you. Because I know there's people out there that need to be encouraged, that need to be prayed for. People out there that need to be forgiven. People out there that need to ask other women in ministry for forgiveness for the way you've treated them, treated us. And there's people out there that need to be reminded that God created you in your own most being, and He has called you to speak His word.